Mrs. Carter, are you still driving the 2024 Black Ridge SUV financed under your name? The woman on the phone sounded polite, almost cheerful. For a moment, I thought she had called the wrong number. I looked out my kitchen window at my aging blue Toyota parked in the driveway, the same car I had been driving for more than a decade. I'm sorry, I said slowly. There must be some mistake. I don't own an SUV. The line went quiet. Then I heard the soft clicking of a keyboard. The account ending in 7724 is currently 60 days past due, she continued. If payment is not received, further action may be taken. My stomach tightened. I was 67 years old. I lived alone in a modest ranch house outside Columbus, Ohio. My husband had passed away 6 years earlier, and since then I had learned to live carefully. I paid every bill on time. I clipped coupons. I kept a small notebook where I wrote down every expense, right down to the last dollar. That was something I avoided. That was something that kept me awake at night. Can you tell me whose account this is? I asked. The account belongs to Evelyn Carter, she replied. That's me, I whispered. After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the sunlight stretching across the wood surface. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. My hands rested on either side of the phone, perfectly still. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe someone had entered the wrong social security number. Maybe there was a simple explanation. But deep down, a quiet feeling had already begun to form. The kind of feeling that arrives before bad news. The kind that tells you your life is about to change. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. I carried it inside and opened it beside the sink. The packet contained loan documents, payment schedules, insurance information, and copies of signed forms. Every page carried my name, Evelyn Carter, my address, my date of birth, my social security number. I read the papers once, then twice, then a third time. The loan amount was $48,000. The vehicle had been purchased 11 months earlier. According to the bank, I had personally signed every document. I turned to the final page and felt my pulse quicken. There was a signature at the bottom. It looked almost exactly like mine. Almost. The shape of the letters was right. The spacing was right. Even the little curve beneath my last name had been copied. But it wasn't mine. I knew every stroke of my own signature after decades of signing checks, tax returns, and mortgage forms. Someone had practiced it. Someone had studied it carefully. I carried the papers into my living room and spread them across the coffee table. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. Outside, a lawn mower hummed somewhere down the street. Everything sounded normal. Everything looked normal. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. I started reading every page line by line. Buried near the back of the packet was a delivery confirmation. The vehicle had been delivered directly to a residential address. I expected to see some dealership storage lot or transportation company. Instead, I found a street name I recognized immediately. My breath caught in my throat. Maple Street. I knew that address. I had visited it dozens of times over the years. Christmas dinners, summer barbecues, family birthdays. The house belonged to my older sister, Linda. I stared at the page until the numbers blurred. Then I looked at the signature again. For the first time, a possibility entered my mind. It was so painful, so unbelievable, that I immediately pushed it away. But the thought refused to leave. And as the afternoon shadows stretched across my living room floor, I realized I could no longer ignore it. I did not sleep much that night. The loan documents remained spread across my coffee table long after the sun had gone down. I sat in my recliner with a blanket across my lap, staring at the address on Maple Street. Every few minutes I convinced myself there had to be another explanation. Then I would look at the paperwork again, and the explanation would disappear. Linda was my older sister by 3 years. Growing up, she had always been the confident one. She walked into rooms as if she belonged there. People listened when she spoke. Teachers liked her. Neighbors admired her. Even after we became adults, she carried herself with the same certainty. I had spent most of my life believing she knew things I did not. When our parents passed away, Linda handled most of the arrangements. When my husband Frank died, she stood beside me at the funeral and held my hand. At least that was the memory I had carried all these years. The next morning, I pulled out an old photo album from the hallway closet. I am not sure why. Perhaps I was looking for reassurance. Perhaps I wanted proof that the woman in those loan documents could not possibly be the same person smiling beside me in family photographs. The album smelled faintly of dust and old paper. I turned pages slowly. There we were as children, standing in front of our parents' house. There we were at my wedding. There we were holding our babies years later. For a moment, I felt foolish for even considering the possibility. Then another memory surfaced. About a year earlier, Linda had called asking for copies of several financial documents. She said she was helping organize a family genealogy project and wanted accurate dates and records. It had sounded harmless at the time. I remembered mailing copies of tax forms and identification paperwork without giving it much thought. The memory settled heavily in my chest. By noon, I decided I needed facts, not memories. I logged into my credit monitoring account. The screen loaded slowly. When the report finally appeared, I felt the room tilt around me. The vehicle loan was not the only account attached to my name. There were credit cards I had never opened. There was a personal line of credit I had never requested. Several balances were already overdue. I stared at the numbers in disbelief. For nearly an hour, I reviewed every entry. Some accounts stretched back months. Others were more recent. Together, they painted a picture of someone living a life I had never lived. Someone had been borrowing money, making purchases, and signing agreements while using my identity. My hands shook as I printed the report. Page after page slid from the printer tray. The stack grew thicker. I placed everything neatly into a folder. Organizing paperwork was the only thing keeping me calm. Near the end of the report, I noticed something else. Several accounts listed a contact address for verification purposes. My eyes locked onto the street named immediately, Maple Street. The same address appeared again and again. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The evidence was still incomplete. I knew that. Suspicion was not proof. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Outside, a light rain began tapping against the kitchen window. The house felt unusually quiet. I opened the folder one more time and looked at the address. Then I whispered my sister's name into the empty room. Hearing it out loud made everything feel more real. And for the first time, I realized that whatever truth I was about to uncover might be far worse than the debt itself. I spent the next 2 days gathering every document I could find. Bank statements, tax returns, insurance records, old correspondence. My dining room table disappeared beneath stacks of paper. The more I searched, the more unsettled I became. Small details that once seemed meaningless now felt important. A credit card application I never remembered completing. A change of address confirmation that had arrived months earlier and then somehow vanished. A phone call from a lender that I had dismissed as a scam. Looking back, the warning signs had been there all along. I had simply trusted that no one in my family would ever misuse my information. On Thursday morning, I drove downtown to meet with a representative from the credit bureau. The office occupied the 6th floor of a gray building overlooking the river. The waiting room was quiet except for the faint hum of air conditioning. I sat there clutching my folder while younger people tapped on laptops and checked their phones. When my name was called, I followed a man named Mark Benson into a small office. He listened carefully as I explained everything. He did not interrupt. He did not rush me. When I finished, he reviewed the documents one by one. Occasionally he nodded. Occasionally he typed notes into his computer. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "this does appear to be identity fraud." Hearing those words spoken aloud made my chest tighten. Until that moment, part of me had still hoped there was another explanation. A clerical error, a misunderstanding, anything. But the facts sitting in front of us told a different story. Mark printed additional records connected to the accounts. Most of the information confirmed what I already suspected. Then he handed me a page that stopped me cold. It contained a contact phone number used repeatedly during account verification. I recognized it immediately. I had called that number dozens of times over the years. It belonged to Linda. I stared at the page without speaking. Mark noticed my expression. "Do you know the number?" he asked. I swallowed hard before answering. "Yes," I said quietly. "I know it very well." The drive home felt longer than usual. Rain clouds covered the sky, turning the afternoon gray. Traffic crawled along the interstate. I barely noticed. My mind kept replaying old memories. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations. Linda laughing across a table. Linda bringing homemade pie. Linda asking about my finances after Frank died. At the time, I had interpreted those conversations as concern. Now I wondered whether she had been collecting information. That evening, I parked across the street from her house on Maple Street. I told myself I was only there to think. Nothing more. Her home looked exactly as it always had. The white shutters, the flower boxes beneath the windows, the American flag hanging beside the front porch. Then a black sport utility vehicle pulled into the driveway. It was spotless, new, expensive. I watched Linda step out from behind the wheel. She smiled as she carried shopping bags toward the front door. For a brief moment, she looked happier than I had seen her in years. My eyes drifted to the license plate, then back to the vehicle, then back to my folder resting on the passenger seat. The loan amount, the address, the phone number, the signature. One by one, the pieces were falling into place. And as I sat there watching my sister disappear inside her house, I realized the truth was no longer hiding from me. The only question left was how far she had been. Willing to go? The following week moved slowly. Every day seemed divided into two parts. The hours when I was collecting information, and the hours when I was trying to convince myself that the information did not mean what it clearly meant. I stopped calling friends. I stopped watching television. Most evenings, I sat alone at my kitchen table reviewing the growing folder of documents. The facts were becoming impossible to dismiss. Yet emotionally, I still struggled to connect those facts to the woman I had known my entire life. On Monday afternoon, I received a call from a fraud specialist assigned to several of the disputed accounts. Her name was Rachel Owens. She spoke calmly and carefully, as though she understood how difficult these conversations could be. She explained that financial institutions often look for patterns, addresses, phone numbers, electronic records, repeated points of contact. According to her preliminary review, the same small group of details appeared across multiple accounts connected to my identity. By the end of the conversation, she recommended that I formally dispute every account and begin documenting all interactions moving forward. After hanging up, I opened a notebook and started writing everything down. Dates, times, phone calls, letters, every detail. It gave me something to focus on besides the hurt. A few days later, I attended a family birthday dinner for my nephew. I almost stayed home. Part of me wanted to avoid everyone. Another part wanted to observe. The restaurant was crowded and noisy. People laughed. Servers carried trays between tables. Children moved from seat to seat while adults shared stories. Linda arrived nearly 20 minutes late. When she entered, several relatives greeted her warmly. She smiled, accepted compliments, and settled into her chair as though nothing in the world troubled her. I watched quietly from across the table. At one point, she pulled out her phone and showed pictures from a recent weekend trip. Then she mentioned plans for another vacation later in the year. Several family members congratulated her on how well things seemed to be going. I listened without saying much. What struck me was not what she said. It was how comfortable she appeared. There was no sign of concern, no sign of financial stress, no sign that banks were calling about overdue balances connected to my name. As the evening continued, I noticed something else. Linda spoke frequently about money, home improvements, new purchases, travel plans, expensive restaurants. Looking back, perhaps she always had. Maybe I had simply never paid attention. Near the end of dinner, she glanced toward me and smiled. It was a familiar smile, the same smile I had seen at holidays and family gatherings for decades. For a moment, I wondered whether she knew that I was beginning to uncover the truth. If she did, she showed no indication. Driving home that night, I felt strangely calm. The fear that had consumed me during the previous weeks was beginning to change into something else. Clarity. The pieces no longer seemed disconnected. The documents pointed in one direction. The account records pointed in the same direction. Even the timing of certain events now made more sense. When I arrived home, I placed the folder on my kitchen table once again. Then I opened it to review a newly received report. Near the bottom of the final page was a detail I had not noticed before. An email address used repeatedly during account verification. I stared at it for several seconds. The name embedded within that address belonged to Linda. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I no longer wondered whether my sister was involved. I began wondering how much she had taken. 3 days after finding the email address, I called Linda and asked if she wanted to have lunch. I kept my voice calm, normal. If she was surprised by the invitation, she did not show it. We agreed to meet at a small diner we had visited for years. The place had red vinyl booths, framed photographs of local high school sports teams, and the same waitress who seemed to know half the town by name. I arrived early and chose a booth near the window. When Linda walked in, she looked exactly as she always had. Well-dressed, confident, comfortable. She smiled when she saw me and slid into the seat across from mine. For a few minutes we talked about ordinary things. The weather, family news, a neighbor who had recently moved away. I almost forgot why I was there. Then the waitress refilled our coffee cups and walked away. I opened my folder and placed a single document on the table. Linda glanced down at it. The smile disappeared for less than a second. Then it returned. "What is this?" she asked. "A loan document," I replied. "One that was signed using my name." She barely looked at it before pushing it back toward me. I would not know anything about that. Her answer came too quickly, too smoothly. I pulled out another page. Then another. The address. The phone number. The account records. Each document landed quietly on the table between us. Linda's expression changed slightly with every page. Not panic. Not yet. Irritation. The kind that appears when someone realizes a conversation is not going the way they expected. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because your phone number appears on these accounts." She crossed her arms. "Lots of people have my phone number. Your address appears too. That does not prove anything." Her voice grew sharper. Several people nearby glanced in our direction before returning to their meals. I kept my tone even. "Then help me understand." Linda leaned back against the booth. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she laughed softly. It was not a nervous laugh. It sounded dismissive. "You always do this," she said. "You worry yourself into believing the worst." I stared at her. Years ago, that response might have worked. Years ago, I might have apologized. But something had changed over the past few weeks. Facts leave very little room for manipulation. "Did you use my information?" I asked. The question hung between us. Linda looked out the window before looking back at me. "No," she said. "Of course not." The answer should have relieved me. Instead, it settled heavily in my chest. Because I knew she was lying. Not because of the words. Because of everything else. The hesitation. The avoidance. The irritation. The refusal to address the evidence directly. Lunch ended shortly afterward. Linda stood, gathered her purse, and shook her head as though she were the injured party. "You are making a mistake, Evelyn," she said. Then she walked away. I remained in the booth long after she left. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, cars moved steadily through the afternoon traffic. I opened the folder again and looked at the growing stack of documents. Before meeting Linda, a small part of me had still hoped there was an innocent explanation waiting somewhere. After that conversation, the hope was gone. All that remained was the truth. And for the first time since this began, I stopped asking whether my sister had done it. I started asking how much evidence would be needed before she could no longer deny it. After the lunch meeting, I stopped trying to convince myself that honesty would solve this situation. If Linda intended to tell the truth, she would have done it when I placed the documents in front of her. Instead, she chose denial. That realization changed the way I approached everything that followed. I was no longer searching for explanations. I was collecting evidence. Rachel Owens called me the following week with an update. Several financial institutions had completed preliminary reviews of the disputed accounts. Their investigators were comparing signatures, communication records, login activity, and account histories. She explained that these cases often moved slowly because every detail had to be verified. I thanked her and prepared myself for another long wait. What I did not expect was how quickly new information would begin appearing. Within days, additional records arrived. Some showed account activity linked to devices that had never belonged to me. Others contained verification requests sent to email addresses I had never used. Every report seemed to strengthen the same conclusion. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Rachel asked if I would be willing to meet in person. We sat in a conference room at her office. A thick file rested on the table between us. She opened it carefully and reviewed several pages. Her expression remained professional, but I could sense that something important had changed. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "multiple independent reviews are reaching similar conclusions." I looked down at the paperwork. Dates, addresses, contact information, technical records. The evidence no longer felt scattered. It felt organized, connected, deliberate. Rachel pointed to several entries and explained how investigators establish patterns. One record by itself might mean very little. 10 matching records told a different story. 20 matching records told an even stronger one. By the time our meeting ended, I felt strangely calm. Not relieved, not happy, calm. The uncertainty that had haunted me for weeks was beginning to disappear. Outside the office, the autumn air felt cooler than usual. Leaves drifted across the parking lot as I walked to my car. I sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. For the first time since this ordeal began, I understood that the truth no longer depended on my suspicions. The documentation was beginning to speak for itself. A few days later, another development occurred. Several lenders began reversing responsibility for disputed balances while their investigations continued. Collection calls that had once arrived daily started slowing down. Some stopped entirely. It was a small change, but it felt significant. The pressure that had been building around me was shifting elsewhere. Then came the phone call I will never forget. Rachel informed me that investigators had connected multiple disputed accounts through overlapping contact information and verification records. She could not discuss every detail, but she confirmed that the evidence trail was becoming very clear. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my living room and stared at the framed photograph of Frank on the bookshelf. I found myself wishing he were there to talk to. He always had a way of simplifying difficult situations. After a while, I realized something important. For weeks I had focused on proving what happened. Now another question stood in front of me. What would happen when the investigations were finished? Because evidence creates consequences. Accounts create obligations. Loans create liabilities. And somewhere beyond the paperwork, the person responsible would eventually have to face the reality that documents do not forget and financial institutions do not simply look away. The call came on a Tuesday evening just after 6 o'clock. I had finished washing the dinner dishes and was drying my hands when my phone rang. The screen displayed Linda's name. For a moment, I simply stared at it. During the previous several weeks, she had barely contacted me. Now she was calling unexpectedly. I answered on the third ring. Her voice sounded different immediately. The confidence I had heard at the diner was gone. In its place was something I had never associated with my sister. Uncertainty. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "I need to talk to you." I sat down at the kitchen table without responding. Outside, the evening sky was beginning to darken. "What is it?" I asked. There was a long pause. Then another. Finally, she sighed. "People have been calling me." The statement was vague, but I understood exactly what she meant. Investigators, lenders, institutions reviewing account records. The process that had once felt slow was now moving forward. "I see," I replied. "This has gotten out of hand," she said. "Things are being misunderstood." I closed my eyes for a moment. Even now, she could not bring herself to tell the truth. Everything was a misunderstanding. Everything was someone else's mistake. "Linda," I said calmly, "is there something you want to tell me?" Silence filled the line again. Then her tone changed. She began explaining how difficult the past few years had been. Rising expenses, unexpected bills, financial pressure. Some of what she said may even have been true. Life can become complicated. People face hardships. I understood that better than most. But hardship and dishonesty are not the same thing. One does not justify the other. As she spoke, I noticed something important. She apologized for circumstances. She apologized for stress. She apologized for misunderstandings. She never apologized for the accounts. She never apologized for the signatures. She never apologized for using my identity. When the conversation ended, I felt strangely disappointed. Not because I expected perfection, because I expected honesty. The next several weeks brought more developments. Additional disputed accounts were transferred away from my responsibility while investigations continued. Collection notices that once arrived regularly became rare. Some institutions sent written confirmations acknowledging ongoing fraud reviews. Every letter represented another step forward. Meanwhile, rumors began circulating through the family. Relatives called with unusual questions. Casual conversations suddenly felt less casual. People were hearing pieces of the story without understanding the full picture. I shared very little. I did not want sympathy. I did not want sides chosen. I wanted facts. One Saturday afternoon, I drove past Maple Street again. The black sport utility vehicle remained parked in the driveway. But something felt different. The house seemed quieter, less confident somehow. Perhaps it was my imagination. Perhaps it was not. Financial problems have a way of changing the atmosphere around people. The following Monday, Rachel contacted me with another update. Several investigations were nearing completion. Some institutions had begun tracing responsibility back through account records and verification histories. She explained that consequences often arrived gradually, not all at once. One decision led to another. One account affected another. One unpaid obligation created pressure elsewhere. After the call, I sat alone in my living room and thought about everything that had happened. Months earlier, I believed my biggest concern was protecting my credit. Now I understood the situation was much larger than that. This was about trust, about choices, about accountability. And somewhere beyond all the reports and paperwork, a reality was approaching that could no longer be postponed. Because eventually every borrowed dollar, every signed document, and every false statement reaches the same destination, the moment when someone must finally answer for it. By early winter, the investigations were no longer theoretical. Decisions were being made. Accounts that had once appeared under my name were being removed one by one. Written determinations arrived in the mail. Some were only a few pages long. Others contained detailed explanations of findings and account histories. Each envelope felt heavier than the last. Not because I feared what was inside, but because every conclusion moved the situation closer to its inevitable outcome. One afternoon, Rachel called with information that changed everything. Several of the obligations tied to the disputed accounts had created financial strain elsewhere. Certain payments had fallen behind. Credit lines had tightened. Lenders were beginning to take protective action. She explained it carefully, using terms that sounded technical and distant. Yet the reality behind those words was simple. The consequences were spreading. After the call ended, I sat quietly beside my living room window. Snowflakes drifted across the yard. The neighborhood looked peaceful. For months I had imagined what this moment might feel like. I expected anger, satisfaction, relief. Instead, I felt tired, deeply tired. The burden of carrying suspicion had been exhausting. The burden of carrying proof was exhausting in a different way. A few days later, Linda called again. This time there was no attempt to sound casual, no effort to pretend everything was normal. Her voice trembled slightly from the moment she spoke. "We need to talk," she said. I listened without interrupting. She described financial problems, delays, complications, paperwork. She spoke in circles, carefully avoiding certain details while emphasizing others. Finally, she reached the point. She needed help, not advice, not emotional support. Help. The kind of help that would require signatures, statements, and cooperation. The kind of help that might slow the consequences already unfolding around her. I looked across my kitchen toward the folder that had occupied the same spot for months. Every document inside represented a choice someone had made. "I cannot do that," I said quietly. Silence followed. Then came frustration, disappointment, accusations that I was abandoning family. I listened to all of it. What struck me most was what remained absent. Accountability. She still could not bring herself to acknowledge the truth directly. The conversation ended badly. Not with shouting, just distance. The kind of distance that forms when two people are standing on opposite sides of reality. In the weeks that followed, relatives began contacting me more frequently. Some asked questions. Others offered opinions. A few suggested that family members should always protect one another no matter what happened. I understood their perspective. Family matters. Loyalty matters. But loyalty cannot exist without honesty. Protecting someone from the consequences of deception is not loyalty. It is participation. I refused to participate. Shortly before Christmas, I drove past Maple Street again. The decorations were up. Lights glowed around the porch. A wreath hung on the front door. From a distance, everything appeared normal. Yet appearances had been misleading from the beginning. I sat in my car for a moment, watching quietly. Then I noticed something posted near the property. A notice. Official. Temporary. Easy to miss unless you knew where to look. My stomach tightened. Not from surprise. The process had been moving toward this point for months. What surprised me was how real it suddenly felt. The chain of events that began with a forged signature was now approaching a conclusion that could no longer be delayed. And for the first time, I realized that very soon no one would be arguing about what happened anymore. The evidence had already won that argument. The final chapter of this story arrived on a cold morning in January. The sky was gray, and a thin layer of snow covered the lawns throughout the neighborhood. I woke early, made a cup of coffee, and sat by the window watching the quiet street outside my house. Months had passed since the first phone call. Months since the first letter. Months since I learned that someone had built an entire financial life using my name. During that time, I had imagined countless endings. None of them looked exactly like reality. Around mid-morning, Rachel called with the news I already suspected was coming. The remaining reviews had been completed. Responsibility for the disputed accounts had been formally removed from my record. The evidence trail had been accepted. The findings were clear. My credit history would recover. My name had been cleared. After I thanked her, I sat in silence for a long time. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, only relief. A burden I had carried for months was finally gone. Later that week, I drove through Maple Street one last time. The neighborhood looked unchanged. Children played in nearby yards. Cars moved slowly through the residential streets. Life continued as it always does. Yet one property stood as a reminder that actions have consequences. The legal and financial processes that had been unfolding for months had reached their conclusion. The house that once represented stability had become part of a chain reaction set in motion long before anyone realized it. I parked briefly along the curb and looked through the windshield. I thought about family dinners, holiday gatherings, old photographs stored in albums. I thought about the years I spent trusting someone simply because we shared the same childhood. Trust feels permanent when it is given freely. You never imagine the day you might have to measure it against evidence. A few relatives continued to contact me afterward. Some apologized for doubting me. Others remained uncomfortable with the truth. A handful still believed I should have intervened somehow, saved the situation, protected the person responsible. I listened respectfully, but my answer never changed. I did not create the problem. I did not sign the documents. I did not make the decisions. The consequences belong to the choices that produced them. Eventually, the phone calls became less frequent. Family conversations shifted toward other topics. New events replaced old ones. The crisis that once consumed every day slowly faded into the background. That is what time does. It moves forward whether we are ready or not. One evening, nearly a year after everything began, I opened the same photo album I had looked through during those first difficult weeks. The photographs had not changed. The smiles were still there. The memories were still there. But I viewed them differently now. Experience has a way of changing the meaning of familiar things. I closed the album and placed it back on the shelf. Then I looked around my living room. My home was modest. My car was old. My life was quiet. Yet everything in that room belonged honestly to me. Every bill had been paid. Every signature was mine. Every responsibility was mine as well. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. People sometimes assume this story is about revenge. It is not. Revenge requires action. What happened here required only patience. I did not take anything from anyone. I did not demand punishment. I did not seek destruction. I simply refused to stand between the truth and its outcome. In the end, the documents spoke. The records spoke. The choices spoke. And when all the noise finally disappeared, the lesson that remained was surprisingly simple. Trust is valuable. Family is valuable. But neither one is strengthened by protecting a lie. Sometimes the most difficult thing a person can do is step aside and allow the consequences of a decision to arrive exactly where they were always headed.